I watched my daughter-in-law throw a suitcase into the lake. At first, I thought it was just old clothes until I heard a faint thud from inside. When I dragged it out and unzipped it, what I saw made my heart split in two. That was the moment I knew I had to take back control. My name is Irene Wallace, and I want to start by asking you something. Where are you watching from tonight? Because wherever you are, I need you to picture this with me. The water, the fog, the kind of morning where even the birds hesitate to sing. That's how it was that day, the day I stopped pretending everything was fine. I live alone, in the same cedar house my late husband built 40 years ago, overlooking Maplewood Lake. It's quiet here, maybe too quiet sometimes. I used to find comfort in that stillness, the way the mist rose from the surface like it was guarding secrets. But lately, that peace had turned uneasy. There were things I noticed, but brushed aside unfamiliar cars parked near my son's place, late-night arguments echoing faintly through the trees, and Sophie's sharp voice slicing through the calm. Sophie, my daughter-in-law. My son, Ethan's wife. Beautiful, polished, the kind of woman who never left fingerprints on anything. That morning, I stepped out onto the porch with my cup of coffee and my old wool shawl wrapped tight. The lake shimmered faintly in the dawn light, and that's when I saw her, Sophie, standing at the edge of the dock alone. She was in a cream coat, her blonde hair twisted neatly like she was posing for a photograph. Only her movements weren't graceful. Musk of cedar and oil angry, that clung to his favorite tie. My hands dragging something large and heavy, a suitcase the kind you'd take for a long trip. She glanced around once, sharply, as if to make sure no one was watching. I ducked behind the porch beam, holding my breath. Then she heaved the suitcase forward with both hands. It hit the water with a hollow splash, and ripples spread wide across the lake. I remember thinking, what on earth is she doing? But before I could move, I heard it. A faint, muffled thud, one that didn't sound like metal or clothes shifting. It sounded alive. My heart began to hammer in my chest. The sound lasted barely a second, but it rooted me to the ground. I didn't think. I just ran. The boards of the dock were slick beneath my shoes as I stumbled toward the edge. Sophie was already walking away, fast, her heels clicking against the planks. She didn't look back. By the time I shouted her name, she had vanished into the trees. The suitcase was sinking slowly, bubbles rising from its seams. Without another thought, I dropped my shawl, kicked off my shoes, and plunged in. The cold hit like knives. I gasped, choking on lake water, but I reached out blindly until my fingers brushed rough fabric. It was heavier than I expected. So heavy I had to drag it inch by inch toward the shore, gasping, trembling, my arms burning. Every second felt like it lasted an hour. I don't remember crying, but I remember the taste of salt on my lips when I finally pulled it onto the muddy bank. For a long time I just stared. The lock had snapped open on impact. The suitcase was old, navy blue with a small silver tag EW, my son's initials. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely unzip it. The sound of the zipper slicing open the fabric seemed too loud, too violent for the quiet morning. And then I saw what was inside. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My breath caught somewhere deep in my chest. It wasn't what I thought it would be. No body, no blood, but it was something worse, in its own way. Something that made my knees buckle and sent me collapsing to the ground. I sat there in the mud, staring while the lake rippled behind me as if mocking my shock. I don't even remember how long I stayed there, minutes, maybe hours. The fog thickened, and the birds finally began to sing again, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Because what was in that suitcase told me something I'd been too afraid to see. Sophie wasn't just cruel. She was erasing something or someone right out of existence. And that thud I heard from inside, that wasn't just a sound. It was a secret trying to stay buried. I didn't open that suitcase again right away. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in the stillness, my soaked clothes clinging to my skin, my mind spinning. The name tag on that suitcase, EW, wouldn't stop flashing before my eyes. Ethan Wallace, my boy, my only child. And Sophie had thrown it into the lake. I kept asking myself why. Why would she want to hide something that belonged to my son? What could she possibly gain from burying a piece of his past? But the more I asked, the less sense anything made. Unless it wasn't about sense. It was about control. I didn't always think of Sophie that way. In fact, I remember the day she first walked into our lives like a gust of warm air that blew all the dust off my quiet little world. Ethan had brought her home one spring evening. He was 26 then, freshly promoted at the architecture firm, glowing with purpose. Sophie came in wearing a white blouse and a smile that could melt ice. "Mrs. Wallace," she said, extending her hand, "it's so wonderful to finally meet you." Her grip was firm, her perfume subtle like roses and money. I remember thinking, she's too perfect. Not beautiful in a soft, natural way, but in the kind that looks rehearsed like a woman who practices her expressions in the mirror before using them in public. But Ethan was smitten. His eyes followed her every movement. And who was I to judge? He'd lost his father young. He'd spent years chasing stability, belonging. If Sophie gave him that, I wanted to believe it was love. She called me mom within weeks, too soon, really. And though the word should have warmed me, something in her tone always felt like a performance. She'd bring me flowers, compliment my old recipes, and then, without fail, find a way to correct something I'd said. "Actually, Irene," she'd say gently, "Ethan doesn't like too much salt anymore. He might have used to cook that way, but he's changed." I'd smile and nod, pretending it didn't sting, but inside a quiet sadness began to settle. Ethan changed. Not all at once, but bit by bit, the way a shoreline erodes so slowly you don't notice until the house is half gone. He stopped calling as often. He skipped Sunday dinners, saying work kept him busy. When I did see him, he looked tired. Not the normal kind of tired, but drained, like his light had dimmed. One night, I visited their new house, a sleek, modern thing Sophie had insisted on buying, though Ethan had wanted something simpler. I brought over a pie the way I always did. Sophie greeted me at the door, smiled that perfect smile, and didn't let me in. "Oh, Irene," she said sweetly, "Ethan's sleeping, and he's had a long week. Why don't you call next time before stopping by?" I could see his shadow through the frosted glass behind her, standing in the hallway, silent. That night, I cried all the way home. I told myself she was just protective, maybe a little controlling, but love can be strange, can't it? We make excuses for the people who make us uncomfortable because the alternative, admitting something's wrong, feels too heavy to carry. As months passed, Sophie's visits to the lake house grew less frequent, and when she did come, she treated it like an inconvenience, brushing dust off the furniture, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. I began to feel like a guest in my own home. I once caught her standing by the old bookshelf, staring at Ethan's childhood drawings, the ones he'd made for his father before he passed. She smiled not fondly, but in a way that made my stomach twist. "Ethan's such a talented man," she'd said softly, "though I suppose we all outgrow childish things." That line stuck with me. Outgrow childish things. I didn't realize then that Sophie wasn't just tidying up our home, she was rewriting Ethan's history. Piece by piece, she was cutting out the parts of him that connected back to me, to his father, to who he truly was. And when the old photo albums went missing a few months later, I thought maybe I'd misplaced them. Now, looking at that suitcase by the water's edge, I knew better. Every missing picture, every trinket, every letter, they weren't lost. They were taken, hidden, erased. Sophie had always smiled like she was preserving something. But that morning by the lake, I realized she'd been burying it. I wrapped the suitcase in an old blanket and carried it back to the porch, my arms trembling. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear Sophie's car starting. She didn't look back then either. She never did. And I whispered into the fog, not sure if I was talking to her or myself. Love shouldn't make someone disappear, but Sophie's love made my son vanish before my eyes. I didn't touch the suitcase again until nightfall. It sat at the edge of my porch all day, dripping lake water, a silent accusation. Every time I looked at it, my chest tightened. I wanted to open it, but I was afraid of what it might confirm. Because deep down, I already knew this wasn't just about old belongings. This was about erasure, deliberate, cruel erasure. When the sun finally sank behind the trees and the lake turned black, I carried the suitcase into my living room. The air smelled of damp earth and coffee gone cold. I turned on the lamp, the one with the yellow shade Ethan had made me in high school, and sat down across from that heavy, waterlogged thing. My hands trembled as I reached for the zipper. The metal was still cold. It hesitated just like me before sliding open with a tired sigh. Inside was a tangle of fabric and paper, darkened by water. I pulled one corner of cloth free and recognized it instantly. A small knitted sweater, blue and white, the one Ethan had worn on his first day of kindergarten. My breath caught. Underneath it, a bundle of faded photographs, me, Ethan, and his father, smiling by this very lake long before Sophie came into our lives. Each one warped, edges curling, faces dissolving into water stains. And beneath those, letters, my letters, hundreds of them. The ones I'd written to Ethan after he married Sophie every birthday, every holiday, every just checking in, that I thought had been ignored or lost in the mail. All of them here, unopened. Some envelopes were still sealed. Others had been ripped, as if by impatient hands. Each one had my handwriting careful, looping, motherly. Each one, a message Sophie had intercepted. I picked one at random, the ink bleeding into the paper, but the words still legible. I hope you're eating well, sweetheart. I made your favorite stew today and thought of you. Tell Sophie I said hello. I had written those words 3 years ago, and Sophie had thrown them into a suitcase. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The weight of it, all those lost connections, all those stolen words pressed down on me. My body shook with a quiet, ugly sob. I felt like I was holding the bones of something sacred. Then I found it wrapped in an old handkerchief tucked carefully beneath the pile. My husband's watch, silver, cracked face, still ticking faintly. That was the breaking point. I pressed it to my chest and let the tears come. I cried for my husband, for the years I'd spent missing him. I cried for Ethan, my boy, caught in a web he didn't even see. And I cried for myself for being so naive, so eager to believe that Sophie's smiles meant peace. But grief turned to something else, something hotter, sharper, anger. I wiped my face and stood up. The letters scattered across the table like fallen leaves, each one whispering the same truth. Sophie had been cutting the cord between me and my son, one thread at a time. I could almost hear her voice, now soft, reasonable, dangerous. Irene, you worry too much. Irene, we're building our own traditions. Irene, maybe it's time to let go. But what she really meant was disappear, Irene. And I almost had. I gathered the letters, spreading them out to dry by the fireplace. Some of the words had bled into each other. Love, proud, miss you. It looked like my heart had melted across the page. I sat there for hours, staring into the flames, thinking of Ethan, of his quiet eyes, of how easily he'd stopped calling, stopped visiting. Maybe he thought I'd turned cold. Maybe he believed I'd given up. He didn't know Sophie had been the wall between us. I thought about calling him right then, right there, but I couldn't. If she was still with him, she'd intercept that call too. Instead, I whispered into the silence, "She won't take you from me again." The clock ticked softly beside me, my husband's old watch as if agreeing. Outside, the lake was still. But I knew better now. Still waters don't mean peace. They mean something's hidden beneath. And that suitcase, that sad, heavy thing wasn't just a box of memories. It was a message, a warning. Sophie wanted Ethan's past to disappear, to vanish, just like she'd made him vanish from my life. But not this time. Not anymore. Because now I had proof. And proof is something even the calmest lake can't swallow forever. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat by the fire, listening to the lake whisper outside, the suitcase drying open beside me like a wound that refused to close. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I had to see Ethan. Not a phone call. Not a text that Sophie could intercept. I needed to look into my son's eyes and see the truth for myself. So I packed the letters carefully into a basket, along with some muffins I'd baked a peace offering, though peace was the last thing I felt, and drove into town. Their house stood on the hill overlooking the main road, all glass and symmetry, a place that looked too perfect to be lived in. When Sophie opened the door, she smiled the way she always did, wide, warm, rehearsed. "Irene, what a surprise! You should have called." Her voice had that sing-song lilt of someone who thought they were in control. I forced a smile. "I was in the neighborhood, thought I'd stop by to see my son." Her eyes flickered for half a second, a crack in the porcelain. Then she stepped aside. "Of course. Ethan's just finishing a conference call. You know how he is with work." The house smelled sterile white lilies and floor polish. No trace of Ethan's old scent, the one that used to fill his room after late-night sketching sessions, ink, coffee, and cedar. I sat on the edge of the pristine white sofa, watching Sophie glide across the room like a dancer. Everything about her movements was curated: the turn of her wrist, the way she adjusted a vase that didn't need adjusting. "Coffee?" she asked. "Sure." While she disappeared into the kitchen, I let my eyes wander. The walls were bare, no photos, no artwork, nothing personal. It felt more like a showroom than a home. Then I saw it, a small silver frame tucked discreetly behind a lamp on the sideboard. It was a photo of Ethan as a child, grinning with a missing front tooth, mud on his face. My heart caught. But then I realized the photo was folded inward, turned so the picture faced the wall. I turned it back around. Sophie's voice came sharp from behind me. "Please don't touch that." I froze. Her tone had shifted colder, thinner. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze. "I just thought it was strange," I said softly, hiding his smile like that. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We're redecorating. I prefer clean lines, minimal distractions." "Memories aren't distractions," I said quietly. "They're roots." Something flickered in her expression, then a flash of irritation, quickly buried beneath charm. "You always were sentimental, Irene." Before I could reply, Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked smaller somehow. His shoulders slumped, his face pale, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. My heart clenched at the sight of him. "Mom," he said, surprised. "You didn't tell me you were coming." Sophie's voice cut in sweetly. "She wanted to surprise you, darling." He hesitated, glanced between us, then smiled faintly. "Well, it's good to see you." I reached out, squeezing his hand, and that's when I noticed it. Bruises. Dark ones, around his wrist. He quickly pulled away, tucking his hand into his pocket. Sophie noticed the glance. Her smile froze. "I fell," Ethan said quickly. "Clumsy me." But the way he said it, his tone was flat, practiced. My son, who used to tell the truth with his whole heart, now sounded like a man afraid of the echo of his own words. I wanted to scream, to ask what was really happening, but Sophie's eyes held mine, daring me. I swallowed my fury and forced a gentle tone. "Be careful, sweetheart. You always bruise easily." Sophie turned toward the kitchen again. "Ethan, you'll be late. Didn't you say you had that early client meeting?" Her control was surgical. She moved him like a piece on a chessboard. Before he left, I pressed the basket into his hands. "I made muffins," I said softly, "for later." He smiled weakly. "Thanks, Mom." And then he was gone. The silence that followed was thick as tar. Sophie leaned against the doorframe, folding her arms. "You shouldn't come unannounced, Irene. It disrupts his schedule. He needs structure." "Structure," I repeated. "Is that what you call this?" Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "You're projecting. You've never handled change well." And there it was, that subtle twist of words she used to make me doubt myself. But not this time. I'd seen too much. When I got home that evening, I played an old voicemail on my phone, one I'd saved, but never really listened to fully. Ethan's voice, trembling, half-whispered, "Mom, please don't call here anymore. It makes her angry." Then a click. End of message. My blood went cold. I sat there in the dark, clutching my phone, realizing that my son wasn't distant by choice. He was trapped emotionally, maybe even physically. I walked to the window, looking out at the lake again, calm and glassy in the moonlight. The reflection of the sky shimmered on its surface as though daring me to see deeper. And I whispered, if she thought I'd stay quiet, she chose the wrong mother. For days after that visit, I couldn't shake the image of Ethan's wrist, the dark bruises shaped like fingers. They haunted me more than the sound of that suitcase hitting the water. Every night, I replayed that faint thud in my head. Every morning, I looked at the letters drying by the fireplace, each one proof of how far Sophie had gone to erase me. But now, it wasn't just me she was erasing. It was him. I began to notice small things that hadn't seemed strange before. The way Sophie always answered Ethan's phone for him. The way her car was always parked so close behind his in their driveway, as if to trap him in. How his smile, once warm and easy, now seemed like something he put on carefully, like a uniform. I couldn't ignore it any longer. So I started digging. The first person I spoke to was an old neighbor of theirs, Mr. Hanley, a quiet widower who'd lived across the street for 20 years. He used to watch Ethan play basketball as a teenager. When I knocked on his door, he greeted me kindly, though there was hesitation in his eyes. "I thought you'd moved away, Irene," he said. "No, just been quiet," I replied. "I wanted to ask about Ethan. Have you seen much of him lately?" He sighed and glanced around before lowering his voice. "Not really. Used to wave every morning, but lately, not so much. That wife of his keeps him busy, I guess." I hesitated. "Have you ever heard them argue?" His face changed. Something flickered guilt, maybe fear. "I did once," he said softly. "Last summer, late at night, I was out watering the plants and heard shouting. She was furious about something throwing things. I almost went over, but then I heard her laugh." He shook his head. "It wasn't a nice laugh, Irene. It was the kind that gives you chills." A laugh. That detail burned itself into me. I'd heard Sophie laugh like that once at Ethan's birthday dinner, when I told an old story about him crying over a lost toy. She laughed, just a little too hard, a little too long. Now I understood why it made him flinch. That night, I went through the old letters again, one by one. In between them, I found something I hadn't noticed before, a folded piece of paper that wasn't mine. The handwriting was Ethan's. The ink was smeared. The words rushed, but I could still read them. "Mom, if you ever find this, I'm sorry. She doesn't let me call. She says you make me weak. She says I need to forget who I was. I can't talk right now. I'll try again soon." The date at the bottom was almost 2 years old. He'd tried to reach me, and she'd made sure I never saw it. I pressed the note to my lips, feeling the paper tremble against my breath. I wanted to storm into their house and drag my son out that very night, but something told me if I pushed too soon, I might lose him for good. So I waited, and watched. I started going into town more often, just to pass by his office. Some days I'd see him through the window sitting alone, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on his computer. Once I caught him looking out the window, right at me. For half a second, recognition flickered. Then Sophie appeared behind him, touching his shoulder, and he turned away. My chest ached. That evening, I stopped by the grocery store. As I paid for my things, I overheard two women chatting near the register. "She's selling the lake house," one of them said. "The one Ethan's mom lives near?" "Yeah, his wife's been talking to a realtor, says she wants a clean start, moving out of state." The lake house. My lake house. The home my husband built. The one I'd planned to leave to Ethan someday. I didn't know what shook me more, the audacity of her plan, or the quiet, calculated way she was doing it. She was cutting the last tie between us, erasing me completely. That night, I walked down to the dock. The moonlight stretched over the lake like silver threads, pulling at the water's surface. And I remembered what Mr. Hanley said that laugh in the dark. Sophie had thrown the suitcase here, at this very spot. And now she was trying to throw away everything else. I don't know what made me look down, but something glinted in the shallows. A small, rusted tin box caught in the reeds. I waded in and pulled it out. Inside were old receipts, torn notes, a few photographs. One of Ethan, his cheek bruised, his eyes empty. The photo was creased, folded in half, as though someone had tried to hide the damage. It wasn't just emotional abuse anymore. It was physical. My whole body went cold. I clutched the tin box to my chest and whispered, "No more." The lake rippled gently as if nodding in agreement. That night, I stayed up writing in a small leather notebook, dates, details, names. I recorded everything I'd seen and heard, the suitcase, the bruises, the note. And as I wrote, I realized something. The truth was heavier than that suitcase. But I was done letting Sophie carry the narrative. Now I would carry the truth. And I would carry it straight to the surface, no matter what it cost me. The night the truth came out, the air was heavy, thick with the smell of rain and the slow roll of thunder that hadn't yet arrived. I remember standing by my window, that tin box open on the table, the photographs spread out like evidence in a courtroom. I'd spent days trying to decide what to do. Go to Ethan directly, call the police, tell someone what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew there would only be one moment where the truth could pierce Sophie's web one night, where she wouldn't be able to twist it. And that night came sooner than I thought. It was Friday evening when I saw their car pull into the driveway across the lake. Ethan got out first, his movement sluggish, like a man walking through water. Sophie followed, sharp and purposeful, carrying what looked like another small suitcase. My stomach turned. I didn't think I just moved. I grabbed my raincoat, the notebook, the tin box, and the old flashlight from the drawer. By the time I reached their dock, the rain had started. Slow, deliberate drops that felt like warning bells against my skin. I could hear them arguing inside muffled words, the rise and fall of Sophie's voice. Then a sudden crash. A plate, maybe. I ran to the porch and banged on the door. "Sophie, open this door." For a few seconds, nothing. Then the latch clicked. When she opened it, she looked composed. Too composed. Her lipstick was perfect, her hair dry despite the rain. "Well," she said coolly, "if it isn't the lake witch." I stared past her, searching for Ethan. "Where is he?" She smiled faintly. "Resting. You've upset him enough for one lifetime, don't you think?" I stepped forward, clutching the notebook. "You don't get to talk about my son like that." Her eyes narrowed. "Your son?" She tilted her head. "He hasn't been your son for a long time, Irene. He's mine now." Something inside me snapped. I opened the notebook, showing her the photos, Ethan's bruises, the note he'd written, the receipts from her visits to a clinic I'd traced back to her name. Mine doesn't mean you can own him, I said. It means you love him enough to let him breathe. Her expression faltered. For just a second, I saw something panic, maybe. Then she laughed, that same cold laugh Mr. Hanley had described. You think anyone's going to believe the ramblings of a bitter old woman? She hissed. You've been spying, sneaking, playing detective while your son begged me not to involve you. I took a step closer. Begged or was told to beg? That hit her. Her mask cracked. Just then, Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his face pale. Mom? His voice trembled, raw and small. Sophie spun around. Go back upstairs. But he didn't move. His eyes darted between us, between the woman who'd broken him and the mother who'd refused to disappear. I held out the photo. Ethan, she did this to you, didn't she? He looked down, his hands clenched at his sides. It's not... Then his voice broke. She said it was my fault, every time. She said I made her angry. That was all it took. The dam burst. Ethan collapsed against the railing, sobbing, the years of silence spilling out like floodwater. Sophie's calm vanished. She lunged toward me, grabbing the notebook from my hand and tearing at its pages. You don't know what you're talking about, she screamed. You ruined him before I ever met him. You and your guilt, your control. Before she could finish, Ethan stepped between us. Stop, he said quietly, then louder. Stop. She froze. Rain pounded against the roof now, thunder cracking close behind. The three of us stood there, drenched, shaking, breathing the same fractured air. Then Ethan looked at me, his voice breaking. Mom, she made me lie. About the calls, about the letters. She said you hated me. I wanted to come home so many times. I reached for him, but Sophie suddenly screamed a sound so sharp it made me flinch and ran toward the back door. She grabbed the suitcase and bolted out onto the dock. I chased after her. Sophie, don't you dare! She turned, wild-eyed, the rain streaming down her face. You'll never have him back, she shouted. He's mine. Then, with one desperate motion, she hurled the suitcase into the lake. A hollow splash echoed, just like before. But this time, Ethan was there to see it. He rushed past me and dove in, the water swallowing him whole. My heart stopped. Seconds later, he surfaced coughing, gasping, dragging the suitcase to shore. I fell to my knees beside him, helping him unzip it. Inside were his old things, baby photos, drawings, and the journals I'd written him after his father's death, the ones Sophie had taken from my house years ago. All the memories she'd stolen, all the proof that he'd once been loved, cared for, whole. Ethan stared down at the drenched papers, tears mixing with rain. She said, you burned them, he whispered. Sophie stood at the edge of the dock, silent now. Her face was blank, not angry, not sorry, just empty. When the police arrived later that night, she didn't resist. She just stood there, soaked, staring out at the lake like she was waiting for it to swallow her too. As they took her away, Ethan sat beside me in the mud, the ruined letters clutched in his hands. We didn't speak for a long time. The thunder rolled away, leaving behind the sound of frogs and dripping leaves. Finally, he looked at me and said, I remember now, Mom. I remember everything. And for the first time in years, I believed him. The morning after Sophie was taken away, the lake was so still, it looked like glass. You'd never know the storm had passed through. But the dock still bore its scars, broken boards, muddy footprints, pieces of letters scattered like fallen petals. Ethan and I sat side by side on the porch, both wrapped in silence. He hadn't said much since the night before, but I could see the exhaustion in his face, the kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from years of carrying something too heavy. He was holding one of his old drawings, a crayon sketch of him and his father fishing. The paper was wrinkled, the colors faded, but the innocence was still there. I don't remember drawing this, he said softly, but I remember feeling happy. I nodded. You were. You always were when we came here. He smiled faintly. Then, after a pause, she said you left because you couldn't handle Dad's death, that you wanted to start over somewhere else. I guess I believed it because it hurt less than thinking you didn't want me. The words hit like small stones, not out of anger, but truth. I reached for his hand. I never left, Ethan. I waited. Every single day. I waited for your voice to come through that phone, for your letter to reach me. I thought I'd done something wrong, that maybe I'd pushed too hard. But now I know she made sure you couldn't reach me. He looked out over the lake, his jaw trembling. I knew it didn't feel right, the way she talked about you. It was like she needed me to hate you to keep me close. He exhaled shakily. I should have seen it. I shook my head. No, sweetheart, love makes us blind, not foolish. You saw what she wanted you to see, but you also found your way out. That's what matters now. He turned to me, eyes glistening. How do I even start over? By remembering who you were before the hurt, I said gently, and by forgiving yourself for believing lies that were dressed as love. We sat in the quiet that followed, not awkward, but peaceful, the kind of silence that lets things settle back into place. The sun rose higher, lighting the water until it shimmered like something reborn. Over the next few weeks, Ethan stayed with me at the lake house. We repaired the dock together, board by board. He laughed once, a real laugh, when a plank slipped from his hand and splashed into the water. It was the first time I'd heard that sound in years. Sometimes we talk about her not with hatred, but understanding. Sophie wasn't born cruel, I realized. She was broken in her own way. And she dragged Ethan into the darkness that had once swallowed her. That didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained the hollow look in her eyes that night, as if she'd been living in a house of mirrors, trying to control every reflection until one finally shattered. When the court hearing came, Ethan didn't speak against her. He simply said, "I want peace." And somehow, those 3 words carried more weight than any anger could. Afterward, he came back to the lake one last time before returning to the city. He stood by the water, hands in his pockets, watching the sunlight ripple across the surface. "This place feels different now," he said. I smiled. "It's because you're not drowning anymore." He looked at me, eyes steady. "Neither are you." We hugged for a long time. No apologies, no promises, just the quiet understanding that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to breathe again, even when the air still stings. When he left, I walked back to the dock alone, the same spot where everything had started. The lake reflected the sky, perfectly clear, endless, forgiving. I thought of all the things that had sunk beneath its surface, the lies, the letters, the fear, and I realized maybe the lake hadn't been trying to drown my pain. Maybe it had been trying to cleanse it. I picked up a small, smooth stone and tossed it gently into the water. The ripples spread outward, wide and slow, reaching farther than I could see. "That's for closure," I whispered. And as I stood there, the wind cool against my skin, the sunlight warm on my shoulders, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not revenge, just peace. Because sometimes survival isn't about staying above water. It's about learning to float even after the storm. That was the moment I knew I'd taken back control. And this time, I wasn't letting go.